Salam alaikum. Good evening from Riyadh, and welcome to everyone joining us for this King Faisal Center for Research and Islamic Studies webinar on post-pandemic economic perspectives in Latin America. My name is Dr. Mark Thompson, Senior Research Fellow and Head of the Socioeconomics Program here at King Faisal Center. I'll be your moderator and discussant for this event, and I'm delighted that you could join us. For your information, the event is available in English and Arabic. The King Faisal Center would also like to welcome our speaker for today's webinar, Dr. Ignacio Muñoz, Executive Director of the Center for the Study of Economic and Social Affairs in Uruguay. Dr. Muñoz, thank you very much for joining us. So our topic today is both timely and important, given current concerns regarding the emergence of the Omicron variant of the virus. Now, certainly, we all realize that the impact and the response to the COVID-19 pandemic has varied between both countries and regions and continues to do so with the emergence of this new variant. But our discussion this evening is going to focus on the Latin American experience and also, following Dr. Muñoz's presentation, reflect where relevant on the Saudi one. So firstly, Dr. Muñoz is going to present a general overview of the impact of COVID-19 on Latin America and the recent growth forecasts of 2022, highlighting potential profits from the tailwinds in the short run and challenges for long-term development. And before I hand the floor to Dr. Muñoz, please note that we will have a Q&A session following our main presentation. But you can post any questions or comments at any time during the webinar using the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom page. And we will try and address as many of these as possible in the given time. So without further ado, I would like to invite Dr. Muñoz to give his presentation. Dr. Muñoz, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mark, for the introduction. Thank you very much, the Center, for the invitation to participate in this seminar. For us, it's a pleasure. Here I am in Uruguay, so far away from Saudi Arabia. At our center, CERES, that was founded in 1985, always since the beginning studied not only Uruguay, but also the whole Latin American region. We have a team of researchers here that permanently follow the macroeconomic issues and main challenge of the whole Latin American countries. One by one, we have a team for the different countries and zones of Latin America. For the reason for us is very natural to explain our view, share our view for the region. I'm going to share our presentation. Is that okay? So is that okay, Mark, with the presentation?
Yes, that's fine, thank you.
Okay, thank you. So we are going to talk about post-pandemic economics perspective in Latin America. First of all, let me tell you that Latin America, our region, was the most affected region in the world by the pandemic COVID-19 last year. If we consider the impact on GDP, the change between 2020 and 2019 was the region, both South America and the north part of the region, Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean, that suffered the worst fall in economic activities. That in the case of South America was a fall of 6.7% of the GDP, and the rest of the region, the northern part of the region, 8.5%. At the same time, we suffer, the population of the region suffer the strongest lockdown in the cities and in the whole countries. You can see in this graph the red dots that show the lockdown stringency index that show that Latin America, both regions of Latin America were the region that suffered the most. So this is our background last year. That is important because this affects a lot of variables and living standard in the whole region and present us big challenges. However, when we consider the impact, and when we consider both the April this year projections and the October adjustment of the projection that the IMF consider for the whole region, we have an important point. You can see in this graph for South America in April for this year 2021, the IMF expects a growth rate of 4.9%. But in October, the IMF revised the estimate and project 6.3%. For Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean, they jump from 4.2% to 5.7%. And for the rest of the emerging world, there was no revision. The IMF expect the same growth rate. This is very important because one could say, what's happened in there? What's going on? What was the problem of the region, or the difference of the region with the rest of the region of the world? And I don't know what's happening. Sorry. No. I'm sorry, I have a problem with my 1 second, please. Are you able to see the slides?
Yes, I can see the slide.
I don't know what's going on with my person. Okay. So, and not only the forecast for 2021 changed a lot for the Latin America and the Central America and Mexico. Also the gap, the GDP gap that we define as the difference between the expected value of the GDP at the end of 2021 in April and in October. That we define the real GDP gap forecast, the difference between what was expected previous to the pandemic, COVID, and what was expected now at the end of the year. So that was the welfare that this region, in terms of economic activity, lost due to the pandemic. And South America was to be below pre-COVID trends, about 5%, and Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean, about 9%. The rest of the world, 8%. But in the revision, again, in October revision of the forecast, both regions of Latin America have the strongest reaction in the gap observed relative to the pre-crisis levels. That's a fact. That's are the numbers. Now we are going to understand why this happening, why this behavior of the economics are explaining the situation. The first things that we have to mention is that South America and Mexico are regions that are strongly affected by external factors, specifically South America, because South America is the region of the world, the region of the whole world that, for example, global interest rates and commodity prices are much more strongly correlated with GDP. In other words, for Latin America, low interest rate that we are having now in the world are absolutely positive and relevant, much more than any other region in the world, because Latin America needs external financing from the rest of the world, both in terms of the public need for financing fiscal deficits and for the private sector that need FDI to impulse a lot of projects that the region needs, from infrastructure to agricultural big project that we have a lot of food to produce. Also, in the right-hand side of the slides, you can see that the correlation between GDP in South America and commodity prices is also the highest in the world, much more higher than Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean, and other emerging and developing countries of the world. So what's happened with the prices of food, metals, and oil has a strong correlation with economic activity in this region. We depend a lot of external factors. That's the key point that I want to share with you at the beginning of the presentation. Specifically South America, our region, the region that comes from Colombia to Argentina. And in this region, researchers of the region in the past, so I also work in that issue, there was a big literature, economic literature, that explained this strong dependence on external factors, mainly interest rates and commodity prices. During the history, we have boom and bust of economic activities in the region, hand in hand with the movement of external factors that affect so strong our region. And what's going on with external factors in the last year? First, interest rates are in minimum level. 1.3, 1.5, the 10-year T-bond, US Treasury bond rate. 1.5 is like, in real terms, with an inflation of 6.2 in the US, means a negative interest rate of 5%. That is a critical, and the reference interest rate, this 10-year US Treasury bond yield, is a reference for any kind of investment that's going to happen in this region. Always here, we have to compare the return of any kind of FDI, foreign direct investment, or local investment with the 10-year bond. And of course, if this rate is in this historically low levels, means that we have an opportunity to attract more investors and investment in the region and foster the economic growth. At the same time, we are having this year a strong increase in international food prices, 40%, 39% was the increase since last year in food, that this region is the main exporters of foods of the world. Also, we have a lot of metals and minerals as a region, Latin America. And again, 78% was the increase in metals and minerals in the last year. And finally, oil prices increased 192% in the last year. And also, this region is important, obviously not in the level that Saudi Arabia had, but we have countries with a lot of oil reserves like Brazil, Colombia, Ecuador, and Venezuela. So also Argentina has this reserve of shale oil in the southern part of the country. In other words, this combination of external factors that are totally out of control of our government. This is a fact that comes from abroad, and we can't do nothing to change these prices and rates are absolutely relevant for our region. Given that, we developed this year an index that we try to put all this information together, an index of external factors that have 4 regions, very unfavorable, the red one, unfavorable, above, the light green, the favorable, and the strong green, very favorable external factor condition for the region that we measure since the beginning of the 90s. And what's happened, what we can see in this figure, you can see that the correlation between the index of external factor and the annual variation of the GDP of the whole South America is really, really strong. You can see the light blue line and the yellow line, and you can see that they are almost the same line, and the correlation is very, very high, beyond 90%. And also you can see different phases of the external factors and the GDP development of the region. For example, between 1991 and 1997, the external environment for the region was favorable. You can see this line. And in this favorable external environment, Latin America have a very good years of economic growth. Then, since 1988 and 2003, the region suffered a very, one point, very unfavorable and then unfavorable external condition given by a decline in commodity prices and an increase in interest rate that affects simultaneously negatively the region, and the region suffered at the same time a decline in the average GDP index was in very low levels during 5 years. Between 2004 and 2014 was the golden years for Latin America. We have a boom in economic activities, a boom that maybe again explained by a combination of very good external factors for our region. That was a super cycle of commodity prices. Again, interest rates were very low, and the region have a decade of strong growth and development. Unfortunately, this decade comes to an end in 2015, and between this 2015 and previous to the pandemic, the region was in a context of external factors that were unfavorable for the interest of our region. And before it came the pandemic, the COVID-19, and now the region, with the combination of these prices that increased in the last year of commodities, food, metals, and oil, we are again in favorable region. This explains only this point, the change in the environment that is important for Latin America, explain the revision of forecast that we are having, and we are going to have a much more better 2021 that was expected at the beginning of the year, and also we are going to close faster the gap that separates our trend previous to the pre-pandemic trend. Let me tell you that for our region, we have a lot of model and that we were developing this kind of econometric model in the last 20 years in the center, that we can say that the impact of external factors are so high that two-thirds of the business cycle of Latin America is normally explained by external factors in the short run. The business cycle, the short run, the growth was affected in two-thirds part by external factors in Latin America. That's the result of our empirical work during years. So we are having now a favorable environment. Next year is going to be a challenge. Why? Because there is a thing that is going to change probably next year. That's going to be the global interest rate. If you follow the US economy, you know that every day is getting harder and harder, the discussion between those that consider that the inflation issue is transitory and those that consider that the inflation issue in the US is permanent. More and more analysts every day, and we have to wait until on December 10, when the US government is going to publish the November inflation rate to see what's going on. But if this inflation rate is higher than the current 6.2%, probably those analysts that say that the problem of inflation is permanent are going to win this intellectual battle that we are having around the world. And probably next year we are going to have increases in the interest rate of the Federal Reserve, and also in the market rate, I mean the 10-year US bond, which imply that the external factor condition for the region are going to be not so good for the next year. So we have a opportunity, a window of opportunity that is going to probably close in the next year. Not my view is that they're going to still have favorable condition next year for the region, but not as favorable as 2021, because interest rates probably are going to be higher in the next year, and that affects significantly our region. That's in the short run, but what's about the long run? What we can see when we compare Latin America with the rest of the world, we can see a lackluster growth in the long run in Latin America. When we consider the historical growth of economic activity, real GDP since the average since the 90s, we can see that both regions, Central America, Mexico, the Caribbean, and South America, have a growth rate on average that only are higher than the European countries, only higher than Europe. Middle East and Central Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, developing Asia, all have higher average growth rate. That's a key point for our region. And what is behind this lackluster growth rate, historically growth rate in Latin America? The low levels of productivity. We have a problem of productivity that could enhance investment and growth, permanent growth in the long run. For that reason, in our center, we develop what we call a barriers to productivity index, another index. The first index is for the short run, the external factor index. This index is for the long run. The productivity barriers that affect the productivity of Latin America. And what we can prove that the pre-existing barrier to improve productivity affect Latin America and the Caribbean future perspective after the negative shock caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. LAC countries must implement, that is our critical point that we are insisting every day in our center. Our region, the whole countries, including Uruguay, must implement a structural reform agenda to improve competitiveness and boost economic activity through private investment. Lackluster productivity is a deep and long-lasting problem of these regions, translates in low growth that we as already can see in this previous graph. For that reason, we have to monitor this barrier, measure, have a magnitude of the problem that this region imposed to the external investor and local even investor. So we compute a barrier that have 8 parts that include the technological ability for the investor, the political stability, which is very important, the perception of corruption, the human capital availability to hire, the quality of infrastructure, the tax burden that a firm has to pay in order to produce and sell in this region, the trade openness of the countries of the region, because Latin America as a whole only represents 6% of the whole global GDP. It's a very small country in terms of GDP of the world, though it's critical to have good relationship with the rest of the world in terms of trade. Have free trade agreement to sell and buy products of the rest of the world without paying high taxes, high tariff. And the last point that we consider relevant in this index is the wage rigidity. That's a problem in this region. And I'm going to show you the magnitude of the index. That's for me, it's very, very problematic. We define a barriers that go from 0 to 100. 0 is a country that have 0 barriers in one of these 8 measure of part of the productivity function. And 100 is the worst in the world. So we classify every country of the world for each of 8 parts of the barriers from 0 to 100. The worst is 100 and the best one in the world is 0. Then we take the average by region. And what we have, that Latin America as a whole, considering both Latin America and the Caribbean, was only better than Sub-Saharan Africa. The only region in the world as a whole that higher barriers to productivity is the Sub-Saharan Africa. Latin America is much worse than the emerging and developing Asia, Middle East and Central Africa, emerging and developing Europe, and advanced economy. Again, this is the simple average of these 8 factors that we define as a part of our barriers to productivity. And in parentheses, you can see the evolution of these barriers in the last 5 years. And you can see that the only region that positive sign in this plus 2.5, which means that the region not only have the highest levels of barriers, but also is the only region in the world that's getting higher barriers in the last 5 years. Instead of reducing the size of the barriers, Latin America is increasing the barrier in the last 5 years, when the rest of the world, you can see negative or 0 changes of the barrier. So Sub-Saharan Africa, the same size of the barrier in the last 5 years, but the rest of the part of the world are experiencing reforms, public policies that reduce these barriers to productivity that are another critical to attract private investor and enhance productivity and economic growth. You can see one by one the 8 barriers, and you can see that Latin America and the Caribbean have a strong problem with wage rigidity. It's the highest level of the barrier in the world, which means that a firm in this region have to deal with a strong unions that have to negotiate wages that are totally different to the productivity of labor, and you have to implement a labor policy given that you have a government that obligates the firms to adjust wages without any consideration of the market activity. That's a problem for one part, for a part of this region. And when you measure in comparison with the rest of the world, you can see that Latin America and the Caribbean have the biggest barrier in wage rigidity. Another point that is critical for the region, again, the highest barrier in the world is tax burden. Latin America has a very strong taxes for firms, and unfortunately, without a compensation in terms of the quality of the services that the public sector offer to private firms. The quality of security, of citizen security, the quality of education, the quality of health is not good enough to avoid to pay again in the private sector. That's a problem because the tax burden is very high, but also you have to pay for public services as in the private sector, and this is a cost, and that's a problem. It's a barrier to improve the productivity. Another problem with the region here is better than Sub-Saharan Africa, which is the physical infrastructure. Railroads, roads, port, airport. Latin America needs a high investment levels in this center. In this point, the government are not well equipped with resources to go alone to implement the investment in infrastructure that the region needs. And in that sense, we have a lot of projects to go abroad to have finances to improve the roads, airport, ports, and all the infrastructure. Again, we are only better than Sub-Saharan Africa in terms of infrastructure. Another point that is important is the technological availability. Only better again than the Sub-Saharan Africa, which means that internet connection is difficult in some part of the countries of the region. We mean that the speed of the internet connection is not good in a lot of parts of this region, which means that any other kind of technological requirement that a firm that firm that is trying to invest in this region probably going to have a big investment because the public sector providing these services is not so good. This is not general. For example, in our case in Uruguay, we are an exception in this term, but when we take the average of the whole region, we have a very bad result. Of course, and that is very important, there is a strong heterogeneity in the region. Uruguay is totally different than Bolivia, Paraguay, Brazil, of course, Argentina, but the region as a whole is what we are going to share with you in this moment, and this is our view as a whole region, not as an individual addition of countries. Let me go ahead in one point that is the main concern, which is the human capital, the last barrier that I'm going to focus. Again, the human capital quality of the region is not good, is only better than Sub-Saharan Africa and emerging Europe. But unfortunately, the pandemic impact is going to be terrible in our region. Why? Because when we consider an alternative indicator that I like a lot, which is the result of the OECD PISA test that are taken worldwide every 3 years, in 15 years, old person that are going to start the labor market life, and the OECD every 3 years put the same test in almost 80 countries in the world. Okay, when we consider Latin American countries that participate in this test, the results are the worst. Latin America is the region with the high percentage of students with insufficient level, without getting the minimum standard required with the test. 44% of Latin American students of 15 years old in 2018, that was the last year of the test, were able to get the minimum result in this test, and that was much worse than Middle East and Central Asia, emerging and developing Asia, emerging and developing Europe, and advanced economy. And the main concern of that, when you can see here in the graph, the dot point, the gray dot point, you can see that the percent of days school were closed in the region was the highest level in the world. So not only we have the previous to the pandemic worst result in educational term, but also we have the strong impact on school closing due to the pandemic. That was critical for our region, because in an initial very worst scenario, we have a big impact of almost, you can see 70% of the days of the school were closed last year. 70%, almost the whole year closed for the whole region. That's imply a big loss in terms of human capital. A big loss that we are now unable to measure the impact in the medium run. That's our main concern in terms of productivity, our main concern in terms of the future of competitiveness of the region. This was a big shock of human capital production in the region. 70% of the day without school, without presence in the school, and with a very high level of heterogeneity of the online education. Only the elite of the region was able to learn last year. In my experience, I have 4 kids, and I was with my wife working at the night, every night, in order to help my kids to deal with the platforms and deal with the online education, with all the technology available, with all the resources available. And I was always thinking in that people in the poor neighborhood of the country, that without infrastructure, without support of the family, that was absolutely impossible to participate in the educational training and in the educational process without any kind of support. That was a big concern for the whole region. Latin America, again, was bad at the beginning and very bad during the process of the pandemic, with results very complicated in the future. Another point that I want to raise is the political volatility of the region. We make here in the center a big analysis, a very deep analysis of all the election that we have political, because the election calendar in Latin America was very intense in this year since the beginning of the pandemic. We have election in Uruguay, Bolivia, Brazil, Venezuela, Ecuador, El Salvador, Bolivia, Peru, Chile, Mexico, Argentina, Paraguay, Nicaragua, Venezuela, Chile, and last Sunday in Honduras. For each election, we consider if the national government ideology that was in power in the election was from the center to the right or from the center to the left. And then we see the result that was change or non-change of the office. And we can see that the majority of the cases were changes. No matter if the government was center-right or center-left, the people want a change. And we ask why Latin American people choose to change the government when the election calendar came after the pandemic, COVID-19. And we consider 3 factors: the change in GDP, the fall in economic activity due to the pandemic, the lockdown stringency index, and the daily COVID death average last 30 days before the election date. And you can see in this graph, there is a clear difference at least in 2 indicators between the election that have changed, strongest lockdowns and daily death, and the election in Latin America that have no change, smaller levels of lockdown and much more smaller levels of death related to the pandemic. We extend this analysis for the whole world. We consider 45 elections since the pandemic in the whole world, the universe. All the elections now have the same behavior. Those countries that during the pandemic deal with better measures and smaller levels of lockdown, and at the same time were able to sustain lower level of death relative to the pandemic, where the countries have no change in the government, in the party of the government, so the government was able to continue with another candidate, with another program, but with the same party. And in the world, there was a difference in the fall in the GDP, but that was not statistically significant when we consider an econometric probability model to see the probability of a change in an election. That's our exercise. We can see what's playing the probability of a change in a political election to see the volatility of that electoral calendar puts in our region, and you can, and we was able to find two critical variables: lockdown and daily deaths, that change radically the election, no matter again if the government in office were from the center to the right or from the center to the left. People want to change if consider the pandemic were not well managed by the government in office. That put another ingredient, because if you have an agenda of reform that are from the long run, and you have to implement it, but at the same time you have a calendar that change the government, no matter the agenda, but only matter the pandemic management, you have a problem. And beyond this problem, also, we have a region with the highest levels of social risk. By social risk, I mean the probability of having a potential social disrupt movement, social unrest in the street. The French Institute Euler-Herm produced a global social risk index that was computed, consider a lot of variables for the whole countries of the world, and compute from 0 to 100 the social risk index for this country. And again, Latin America is only better than Africa in terms of social risk, in terms of social unrest risk. Of course, advanced economy are with the best levels of, with the lowest risk levels, then emerging Europe, then the Middle East, and Africa and Latin America in the worst places. And this graph is very interesting because you have four parts. This part, the part that you can see in orange, you can see the majority of the Latin American countries. These parts are the countries that have that are in 2020 big social risks, and between 2015 and 2020 a deterioration of the situation, an increase in the social risk. So these countries that include Venezuela, Mexico, Brazil, Colombia, Chile are in a worse situation now than in 5 years ago, and now are in a critical place to suffer potential social disruption. The only exception in Latin America, because the line of the number 15 in the social risk index in this axis separate those who have above are those countries that have low risk of social unrest, and below this line, the countries with high risk. Only 3 countries of the region have low levels of risk of social unrest, and only 1 country of the region, Uruguay, my country, is improving the index and reducing in the last year the probability of social unrest. You can see in this graph, the only country in this quadrangle is Uruguay. That is critical also for Latin America, because previous to the pandemic, we suffered as a region a social unrest episode in every single country of the region, with 1 exception, only Uruguay. And this social unrest episode put an end in the agenda of reform, put a break in the changes that the country needs, and in some cases, not only a stop, but deterioration, an increase in the barriers. Therefore, my final remarks says the post-pandemic situations for Latin America impose, in my view, a twofold agenda of reform. On the one hand, reform to enhance productivity, but at the same time, an agenda of social policies to address long-term technological unemployment. All the reforms included in this agenda are very complex to implement. That's clear. It's simple. If they were simple, they were already implemented. All these barriers are very difficult to reduce. Not only the proposed reform comes hand with a deep ideological discussion in this vision, from the left to the right, but also they affect the status quo of private interest. The challenge for the region are great and must be managed very carefully to maintain social peace in a region unfortunately characterized by multiple episodes of social unrest in the last year. Therefore, the first order of business for this region should be to rethink social policies in the light of a big challenge that is faced. Why? Because current trends in the labor markets require a deep analysis of all possible support for people who are out of the market. The support for work reinvention could have a greater impact than the current programs such as traditional unemployment insurance. The problem that we are going to have is that the productivity is increasing with the introduction of technology and automation that is higher and higher in this region, but at the same time it's leaving a lot of people outside the market without the abilities required to participate in the labor market, and therefore are structural unemployed. So social policies have to think about that and train these people. The future of the region depends on the ability of the current and new government, both, no matter if the government are from the left to the center and from the right to the center, to implement the required agenda of reform to enhance economic growth and social sustainability, to reduce the barriers that we have for the improvement of productivity in the long run. In my view, of course, this is a very complex task, but it is feasible and it worth. So that's my view. That is our view of the region. And thank you very much for the audience. And I open to any kind of question that you want to share with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Monyo, for your very insightful presentation. And I mean, a lot of things to think about. And you know, I'm not a Latin American expert by any means, but I mean, you know, there were some things that you raised that really did strike me. I just wondered, maybe just a question really that would be very topical, I suppose, given the current global COVID situation. And then that would obviously relate to what extent do you see the emergence of this Omicron variant on recent growth forecasts? You know, and in your opinion, you know, do you see this exacerbating the problems? I mean, I noticed today I was looking at, you know, Bloomberg Economics, and, you know, they were saying that it's obviously too early to predict how this is going to shape the outlook. But, you know, under the worst case, if the new variant totally escapes vaccines, then they're saying this could take the economy back to early 2021. And I wonder maybe if you could say possibly something about that, but also maybe it would be interesting for our audience as well, if you could maybe tell us something about the vaccination status in the region. You did talk to me before the webinar started, and you were telling me, for example, about the situation in Uruguay, and I think that would also be interesting to hear.
Okay, of course, the uncertainty given by this increase in the cases in Europe related to the new wave of COVID-19 is a really bad news for the region. It's a really bad news for the world. The situation is very different in the region. For example, in our country, in Uruguay, we have more than 80% of the population already vaccinated with the full dose. Why? Because we are a very small country, only 3.5 million of inhabitants, and very integrated country. We have no very easy to access for every point of the country, and we have a health system, historical health system that cover all the population. There is no single Uruguayan outside the health system. In that sense, in a few months, the government was able to vaccinate the whole population. And this percent of no vaccinated people are those below 15 years old, are the kids. And in the case of the kids, next week are going to start the vaccination of the kids too, because we have a lot of those. We have a lot of vaccine from Pfizer available now to start the kids' vaccination. In that sense, our country is like, together with Chile, the better countries in terms of vaccination in the whole region. Totally different is the situation in Brazil, in Argentina, in Colombia, in Peru, in Mexico, Venezuela, big countries, very complex countries with different landscape, different cultures, different, very different economical and social situation within the country. Uruguay is an exception in Latin America because it's a very small country, a very integrated country, and very easily to manage in terms of any kind of health problem. For that reason, we are having a so good, and also because our president, Lacalle Pou, was able to understand the needs of the people in terms of lockdown. This country was the country that, in the terms of our numbers, introduced the lowest levels of lockdown in the region and in the world, and also at the same time was able to maintain very low level of death. And in the worst moment, that was in March and April of this year, when the government is starting the vaccination process, the pressure was high, very high for the government. But the government had the conviction and trust in the system of vaccination, and only in 2 months was able to have more than 60% of the people under the vaccine. So that's the story of this country. But if I have to start the story of each of the countries of the region are totally different. It's impossible to go through the story of Brazil, Argentina. It's all different stories of the pandemic management.
Thank you. I mean, what's something that really particularly struck me, and I wasn't aware of, was when you were talking about, the problems of sort of low internet access or internet penetration, technological problems, and I think you were saying, that only sub-Saharan Africa was below the region in terms of technology available. And then when you were sort of then talking about the impact of the pandemic and the impact that it had on sort of the stopping of education, and how that and the sort of the knock-on effect and the ramifications of that on sort of human capital. I mean, that was a really, that's really telling, I think. It was Uruguay an exception again in this respect?
Hopefully, yes. Uruguay is an exception, absolutely exception in terms of the technological availability. We are very close to an advanced economy in terms of technological availability. We are an exception also in terms of not in all the categories, but for example, wage rigidity, we are in the worst place. It's very, very strong, the power of the union here, and also the tax burden, because the Uruguayan government is very big, and we have a welfare state, a historical welfare state in the beginning of the last century, implemented in this country, that put pressure on taxes. Of course, we have a Scandinavian government, but unfortunately not so good public services. That's a problem for our country. But of course, relative to the whole Latin America, Uruguay is an exception, and mainly also in terms of corruption, in terms of political stability and social unrest. All the institutional points, that are relevant to attract investment, Uruguay is like from another part of the world. It's totally different. We have a full democracy, the only full democracy of the whole region. We have you can see the index of social unrest, a very low risk. We have an integrated people in the street. Again, a small country and mainly from European culture. We have no Native American population.
Thank you very much indeed. We're coming to the end of our time. So I wondered if, is there anything you'd like to say to sort of wrap up the discussion and sort of final remarks based on what you've been telling us in your fascinating presentation?
Okay, thank you. My idea was to put in numbers our reality, our regional reality, giving a broad picture of the main challenge and development that we have to face in the next year, which are big. And in order to open a conversation between our two institutions, because it was our intention to have a close relationship with Saudi Arabia and with King Faisal Center, because we are a small country, but we are a very open country with the rest of the world. We live with the head abroad. We share and we love to share different views of the world with different cultures and with different people. And in that sense, we are doing this kind of things, not only with Saudi Arabia, but also with China, with Korea, with India, and with the rest of the Asian part of the world, which are very relevant for Latin America and for our country. We are going to push to have a closer links, cultural and economics, with Middle East and with the rest of the Asia. Much more. We already have historical, since the beginning of our institution, a very close relation with the United States and with the rest of Latin America. Now, since the beginning of my administration last year, my goal is to have closer relationship with Asia, with the whole Asia and the Middle East. So thank you very much for the opportunity to share our views, and we are in touch for future collaboration.
Dr. Maño, thank you very much indeed, and thank you for sort of giving us, such an illuminating talk about an area that sometimes, I'm sure we would all agree that we maybe don't pay very much attention to because we're so sort of focused on the sort of the Eurocentric sort of stories. But thank you very much indeed. So thank you to Dr. Ignacio Maño for joining us today. Thank you all as well who joined in the conversation today. Please look out for future King Faisal Center for Research and Islamic Studies events on our social media platforms, and we look forward to welcoming you again. Thank you very much, everybody, and good evening.